Well, hello and welcome to the Northwood University webinar series. I'm Christopher Deming, and today we have Markets and Modern Policy with Professor Michael Makovi. Dr. Makovi, back in February, gave us a lead up to this presentation where he talked about the refresher of some basic economic concepts. And today we're going to extend that knowledge and add some application to the process. So we're excited to have you, Dr. Makovi. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. As always, this is being recorded. A recording will be sent to you after the fact with a survey. We hope that you fill that out. Many of our great webinar ideas come from you, the viewer, so we hope that you'll be able to join us and give us that survey information so that we can continue to build out our webinar programming. A copy of the slides that Dr. Makovi will be using today will also be included so that you can review them at your leisure. At the end of the program today, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to submit questions using the Q&A tab that's on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So without any further delay, please welcome Dr. Makovi.
Thank you. So I view this as a continuation of some of the topics I didn't get to finish talking about during the last webinar. So talking more about what are the advantages of markets, or how do they help accomplish the goals that we have to live good lives. So one way we can measure the effectiveness of markets is what's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So this is published by the Fraser Institute in Vancouver. I've got a link there. So they publish annual reports, and so every year they publish that. You can also download their raw data if you ever wanted to comb through the data yourself. But what they do is they aggregate publicly available data from different agencies like the World Bank and the UN, and they use all that to measure different countries in 5 different areas that are meant to measure the extent to which a country has a market economy. So they measure the size of government, so that's a measure of taxation and spending. Legal system and property rights measures the extent to which property rights are protected and contracts are enforced. Sound money is basically the extent to which the money is subject to a high rate of inflation or not, and the degree to which governments intervene in credit markets. Freedom to trade internationally is a measure of the extent to which there are or are not trade barriers such as tariffs. And finally, regulation is a measure of the extent to which production and trade are subject to government regulations or not. So these are all measured 0 to 10, or 0 to 10, where a higher score is a more free market. So for example, with size of government, lower taxation and lower spending means a higher score. In 2017, they added a gender disparity index adjustment because they realized that there are some countries that maybe economic freedoms are protected for men but not for women, and that should count against the country, right? We want countries that protect rights for everyone, not just for some members of the population. Now, the cool thing is, so since they're using publicly available data like World Bank and UN data, they're not measuring all these things themselves. They're simply taking other people's measurements and just selecting which specific measurements of different things they want to use and then aggregating it all together. So there's less of a bias there in terms of how they measure the extent to which a country is market oriented or not. And there's been a variety of studies that have basically found that economic freedom as measured by this index is correlated with almost every good thing a person could want. So here I cite a review article, Economic Freedom of the World and Accounting of the Literature, where it's basically a meta-analysis of every study that anyone has used using the Economic Freedom Index. And they have found that basically any good thing a person could want is almost always correlated with economic freedom. I want to illustrate that in the next few slides and just show that we can actually measure the extent to which a market economy promotes a high quality of life and prosperity in a variety of different ways. So I'm taking these graphs here from the macroeconomics textbook we use at Northwood, but similar graphs could be found in the annual report of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So what they do here in this graph is they categorize countries by quartiles. So every country in the world is grouped into one of four groups. The 1/4 of the countries of the world that have the highest levels of economic freedom, then the second quarter, the third quarter, and finally the bottom quarter. And then in each quarter, they take the average here of per capita income. And this is adjusted by purchasing power parity. So this is adjusted for cost of living in each country. So what we see here is that the countries that have the most economic freedom, so the 1/4 of the countries of the world that all rank highest in terms of this index, all also have the highest GDP per capita adjusted for cost of living. So on average, the most free countries of the world have a per capita GDP of $36,770. And you can see if you drop to the second quartile, it drops dramatically down to 22,000. You drop to the third quarter, big drop again. Fourth quarter, big drop again. So pretty immediately we see if you want to have a high per capita average income in a country, it's pretty clear you want to have more economic freedom. So, right, lower taxation, lower spending by government, more protection of property rights, more freedom to trade internationally, more sound money, lower regulation. Now, there's still an ongoing literature to figure out which of those specific subcategories might be more important, right? Maybe protection of property rights has a bigger effect, let's say, than a non-inflationary money. So there's still academic research going on in that area, but at least as a whole in general, we pretty robustly see more economic freedom, more income in a country. But you might say, well, maybe that's the average, right? Maybe average income is higher in free countries, but maybe it's the rich are doing better and the poor are doing worse. So here we divide countries once again into the quartiles, but now we look at what percentage of each country's population lives in moderate or extreme poverty, where that is defined as $1.90 per day and $3.20 per day. So that's just based on World Bank definitions of moderate and extreme poverty. And once again, this is adjusted by the purchasing power parity method. So it's $1.90 and $3.20 per day after adjusting for cost of living. And what we see is the most free countries have far, far lower rates of poverty. As you start moving up or moving down the quartiles to the second, third, and fourth free, we start getting higher and higher levels of both kinds of poverty. So when we say that economic freedom is correlated with higher incomes, it's not just average incomes are higher because the rich are richer but the poor are poorer, or it's not the rich are richer and the poor stay just as poor as they would have been, or something like that. It's no, the poor are getting richer too, or there's fewer of the poor. And then here what we have, you might say, well, okay, fine, maybe we're all getting higher incomes and the poor are better off, but maybe there's environmental costs. So maybe that might be maybe think, okay, markets, we're getting more goods and services, but maybe, we're also filling the oceans with plastic, or, filling the air with smog or something. So what this graph shows is taking an index of environmental performance, and this is from the Yale Center for Environmental. Okay, wait, I have a little. Actually, can't read it. I have a blue jeans thing that's covered. Oh, there we go. Okay, covering up part of my own screen that I couldn't quite see. Right, the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. So what they did here was they simply took some other research institute's measure of environmental performance and cleanliness and said, okay, let's just see, is economic freedom positively or negatively correlated with this independent measure of environmental performance? And what we see is that the countries with the most freedom also rank the highest on environmental performance. So apparently a country with more economic freedom also has a cleaner environment. Now, it's possible there could be multiple explanations for that. It could be that maybe economic freedom is directly related to environmental cleanliness. It could just be that having more economic freedom means we have more availability of technologies and other techniques for having a cleaner environment. Or it could be that when we have a more free market in general, we can use part of our higher income to ask the government to regulate the environment more. And so, by which I mean, a clean environment is itself an expensive good. You have to have a high enough income to be able to afford to indulge in wanting environmental cleanliness. If you're on the brink of starvation, you don't have enough income to worry about whether the air you're breathing is full of smog, because you're just worried about getting enough food tomorrow. It's once you have enough, a high enough standard of living in other ways, that you can start being more interested in environmental cleanliness. So it might very well be that certain kinds of government regulations are necessary for a clean environment. That's a whole separate topic of research and a whole separate discussion. But even if that's the case, that some kind of government regulation or intervention is necessary for environmental cleanliness, it seems that we can only afford to have those regulations if we have an otherwise free market. So that's not necessarily, so that's at least, so even if a person wants to make an argument that government regulation is necessary for environmental cleanliness, we still see in this graph that we still get more environmental performance and cleanliness in general if we have a more free market in general. So that's basically, and this is of course just a sample of 3 different statistics, but it still illustrates the point that economic freedom, meaning a government that low taxation, low spending, and protection of property rights, enforcement of contracts, freedom to trade internationally, a sound money that is not subject to high rates of inflation, low regulations. All of these things are correlated with pretty much any good thing a person could want. You want to have a high average income in a country, you want a low level of poverty, you want a clean environment. All of these things are pretty much correlated with economic freedom. Incidentally, so this measurement here with the environmental cleanliness fits pretty well with what's called the Kuznets curve, which is an observation that we tend to find pollution and corruption of the environment tend to be correlated with very low levels of economic development and very high, let me say that again. Let me start over. Environmental cleanliness seems to be associated most with either highly developed economies or extremely undeveloped economies. It's the economies in the middle that have the worst pollution. And basically what's happening is if you have a very undeveloped economy, well, you're not going to be polluting very much, right? Because you don't have a lot of technology, you're not doing a whole lot that would have polluted the environment in the first place. Then you move up into a middle level of development with a middle level of income, right? You start having factories that are emitting smog and smoke. You have lots of automobiles, right? All these factories are dumping things in the rivers. So you start getting pollution. Once the income increases even above that and you get a highly developed economy, pollution actually starts falling again. And the best explanation is, again, environmental cleanliness is itself an expensive good, right? Every good costs something. Environmental cleanliness itself costs something, and people are only willing to pay the price for environmental cleanliness when their incomes have increased enough that they can actually afford to care about the environment, right? Again, if you're struggling to get enough food or clothing or shelter, you're not going to be so worried about how clean the air is. But once you've satisfied all those other wants, you have all the food, clothing, and housing, and everything else you need, then you can start asking, hey, you know what, I'd like to get some clean air too. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that government intervention is not necessary. That's a whole separate topic. But nevertheless, high incomes require economic freedom, and then high incomes allow us to afford the environmental performance. So that's a brief overview of that. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to that URL I posted. They post their annual reports. Another way to illustrate the effectiveness of markets is to look at extreme cases. Like what happens to a country when it goes from very low levels of economic freedom to a higher level. So here there's a recent study of the country Georgia, where in late 2003, they had what was called the Rose Revolution. Basically what happened was, by a series of almost accidents, a radical libertarian happened to come into political power. And so he wasn't quite a dictator, but he basically had a lot of power to unilaterally promote free markets. I would not say that's probably not a sustainable strategy that we would want to, implement, right? Because anyone who has the power to unilaterally implement free markets also has the power to unilaterally implement, socialism or something else. So I wouldn't say that we should go around, installing, people with unilateral political powers. One of the advantages of democracy is, okay, maybe you don't always get the best government, but you don't get the worst government either. But what happened. They happened to get a radical libertarian who just happened to have a lot of power to unilaterally implement free market reforms. So then there was a study that found, so what happened in Georgia? So this statistical method here is a bit complicated, so can't really talk about it a whole lot. It would take a whole separate lecture by itself. But basically what this graph does is the real country of Georgia is the solid black line. The dotted line is the trajectory it had been on. So the dotted line represents what we think the country of Georgia would have been doing if nothing had happened, if there had been no market reforms or anything else. What we see is the real Georgia dramatically takes off, and this here is measuring per capita GDP. So we can see the country is a relatively poor country, right? We've got somewhere around $6,000 per capita GDP, right? Whereas we saw the most free countries have an average of 36,000. So we're still talking a quite poor country, but still we see that from 2003 to 2015, it goes from about $4,000 per capita GDP until by 2015, we're talking Georgia should have been making $6,000 per capita GDP, but instead it was making about $9,000. So we're talking about 1.5-fold increase. The average resident of Georgia went from would have been making $6,000 a year to instead making $9,000 a year because of these market reforms. right? So a 50% increase in income. I mean, that's, absolutely enormous. Here is infant mortality. So what this graph shows is that as a consequence of implementing market reforms, infant mortality dramatically fell. So once again, markets are associated with pretty much any good thing you could want. It's not just we all make more money. We have a cleaner environment and we have fewer babies dying. So it's pretty, I think pretty remarkable. So that's the Economic Freedom Index. I'll talk about one explanation of why we would see something like this. So this is there are many arguments to be made for markets. So this is only just one of many. But this is what's called the problem or impossibility of economic calculation under socialism. And this was an argument first made in the 1920s by Ludwig von Mises, and the argument was continued by his student F.A. Hayek. Some of you might be familiar with the name F.A. Hayek from The Road to Serfdom. So what this says is the economic problem for any society is to maximize value at least cost. We want to get the most output, where output is broadly defined to mean anything of value. And we want to get it with the least cost. Here, cost means opportunity cost, which means the sacrifice of foregone alternatives. Obtaining anything comes at the expense of not being able to obtain something else. We live in a world of scarcity. We cannot have an infinite amount of everything we could possibly want. So getting anything always means giving up something else. And cost is actually determined by demand. So some people think that cost of production determines prices of goods, but it's actually closer to being the other way around. It's actually prices of goods and demand that determine costs. The reason for that is the cost of anything is the value of the foregone alternative that must be given up to obtain that good. So the cost of a good is a measure of the relative urgencies of demand for competing alternatives. So for example, steel is costly because using steel for any certain purpose requires sacrificing the other purposes that steel could have been used for. If hypothetically steel were useless, if we let's say we discovered some new metal that is extremely abundant and stronger and better than steel in every possible way, then steel would become worthless because it would have no competing alternative uses. No one would have any idea what to do with steel because there would be a more abundant and technologically superior alternative. So steel would basically become like a waste product. And if no one is competing to use it for alternative uses, then there's no opportunity cost. Using steel for any purpose doesn't require giving anything up, so it would become worthless, and therefore it would become costless. The cost of using it would be $0. That illustrates the fact that cost is actually determined by demand. And another way to illustrate opportunity cost is, let's say you could grow melons in Alaska in a greenhouse, but all that energy being used to heat the greenhouse is now energy that can't be used for some other purpose. So that the ultimate economic problem, again, is we want to maximize value at least cost. And the question is how to do that. So the argument about the problem or impossibility of economic calculation under socialism says that any form of central planning might be feasible for a simple economy where there's relatively few goods and relatively few alternatives. So if there's, let's say you're living in a very simple, local, primitive economy. So I don't know, you have wheat, fish, lumber, I don't know, right, you got to build some thatched huts and, right, there's only a few goods. It's not very hard to figure out the trade-off between having more food and a better house. So if your economy is very, very simple, with only a few goods to trade off against each other, it might very well be possible to have an effectively centrally planned economy because there's not a whole lot to plan. But once you get an extremely complex, multi-staged production process, so there's millions of different goods being produced, and each individual good itself has a complex production process split across multiple stages of production, right? So, like, to build a car, well, first you have to have steel. Well, to have steel, you first have to mine the ore. Well, to mine the ore, you first have to have construction equipment. To have the construction equipment, someone else has to have built the construction equipment. Well, to build that construction equipment, right, you keep going back 4 and more stages. And what happens is the knowledge of different demands and the knowledge of different feasible technological alternatives is spread among millions of different people's minds. So no one person can comprehend all of the different possible goods that could be produced and all of the different technologically feasible ways of producing those goods and all of the different trade-offs that have to be made, because producing any good by one technological method rather than another is going to require different resources, and those different resources have different competing alternative uses. Right? So you might have 2 production methods. Maybe one requires more labor but less oil, and maybe the other requires more oil but less labor. Well, what's the trade-off between oil and labor? How much human labor is worth how much oil, right? And that's just 2 goods, oil and labor. Once you add all of the other millions of different resources and goods that are used as intermediate inputs to production, it becomes impossible for any one central planner to ever comprehend all the different possibilities. And so this is sometimes called the knowledge problem, where it's just under any form of central planning, it's impossible to include all of this knowledge. Remember, we're talking about both supply and demand side. It's both the supply side of feasible technological methods of production, but also the demand side of all the different possible goods a consumer could want. And consumers might not even know what they want until they're presented with the opportunity or they're presented with the cost. So, I might say, I want a car that is completely 100% safe in a collision. And then someone says, okay, well, in order to have that, the car would have a top speed of 20 miles an hour, and it would have 1-inch thick steel, and the car would cost $1 million. Oh, maybe I don't want a completely collision-resistant car. So there's always trade-offs, and we don't always even know what the trade-offs are until some entrepreneur comes along and presents some new product that no one else even realized was possible. A simple example of this that's sometimes used is, imagine you want to build a railroad. Well, railroad tracks are typically made from steel, but we could make railroad tracks from platinum. The platinum might be technologically superior, but it would also be more costly. But the only reason why we know that platinum is more costly than steel is because we can look at the market price. Imagine you lived in a world of central planning where there are no prices. How would you know that platinum costs more than steel? What does it mean for something to cost more than something else when there are no prices? Instead, what you would have to do is you have to count up all the competing alternative uses and measure their relative urgency and somehow say platinum is more urgently needed for things other than building railroad tracks. Sure, we could use the platinum to build a railroad track that is technologically superior to a steel railroad track, but using the platinum for the railroad track would require giving up other uses, and those other uses are more relatively urgently needed than a platinum railroad track. A steel railroad track is not as good, but it's good enough. Let's save that platinum for something else. And you would have to be able to say that for every other resource in the world. And that is beyond any human's ability. So goes the argument. Another example.
Hi, Dr. Makovi. Sorry, we're running short on time here, so I hate to interrupt you, but we are coming up against our last little bit here. So I'm going to let you just wrap up this slide real quick, and then we'll get to the questions and answers.
Okay, wow, I guess everything always takes longer than I thought. So much to say. So last example, just to illustrate the point, is let's say you're laying this railroad track. You can either curve around a mountain or you can carve through a mountain. If you curve around the mountain, the railroad will take longer to get wherever it's going, so you're going to incur a travel time for every passenger, and you're going to use more fuel because the train will take longer to get where it's going. And you use more steel because you're laying a longer track. But on the other hand, you don't require as much mining, labor, and engineering to blast through that mountain. If you blast through the mountain, it takes more labor and engineering, but you save on steel track, travel time, and fuel. Well, how much travel time and fuel consumption in steel is worth how much mining, labor, and engineering? How many engineers is it worth tying up their labor in order to save railroad passengers travel time? Well, market prices allow us to measure one against the other. But without market prices, you're stuck with a central planner who is just trying to measure very subjectively and non-quantitatively how much time should a person be willing to save traveling on a railroad to get to their destination in order to make it worthwhile to use more engineers who could have been used on alternative construction projects elsewhere in the country, but now we're going to use them to blast through a mountain instead. So that means market prices communicate more knowledge of relative demand urgency and relative supply of resources and the relative trade-offs of resources against different demands. It communicates more knowledge of all these trade-offs than any other possible method that has ever been conceived of. So that is one possible reason why markets outperform non-market methods of organization. Here I'll just say really quick, there's a YouTube video that's really nice that makes this argument in more detail than I do, but it's quite presentable. So if anyone wants to learn more, you can look at this YouTube video, and I guess there I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Dr. Makovi. I apologize for cutting you off. I know we always have so much great information and we have limited time. So we're happy to field a few questions if any of our guests would like to ask them. I will start myself. It's been said in the past, I think this was a popular argument in the early 90s, the idea of institutions are less important, Dr. Makovi, but what we really need is targeted direct investment in poor countries in order to get them out of a poverty trap, because they don't have the wherewithal to do it themselves. What do you suppose the importance of institutions is relative to that argument that they made earlier in the 90s?
Yes, I think what we've seen from the research is just institutions make the biggest difference among all these countries than pretty much anything else. Like foreign aid, to the extent that it even has an effect, is a relatively small effect. I mean, sometimes the foreign aid actually even makes things worse, because sometimes that money goes to the government, and then that government uses all that money to buy a bigger army to subjugate its population even more. Or it just causes a bloated public sector, and so that government, uses all of that foreign aid just to pay cronies and subsidize favorites. So sometimes it actually makes the country poorer. But even to the extent that foreign aid makes the country richer, it does it only to a very modest effect. In general, I think we get a lot more mileage out of just allowing private investment, right? If you have a poor country, a corporation in a wealthier country, builds a factory there, or otherwise invests in some form. Now that country has a bunch of new jobs. right? But you think about it, it's the way, like, how did Britain industrialize in the first place? How did the U.S. industrialize? It wasn't, there was no foreign aid because there was no richer country to, invest it. The U.S. and Britain industrialized simply by having relatively free markets that allowed people to, invest in whatever was the most cost-effective form of production available, given the economic and technological possibilities of that country. And gradually, the U.S. and Britain became wealthier and wealthier over time, right? And that was the Industrial Revolution. So the same thing for poor countries today. They should have free markets that protect private property, protect individual rights and freedoms from government abuse. And I mean that, in the broadest sense. So I'd also say, freedom of speech, every other human right broadly defined. Let wealthier countries invest in those poorer countries. And I think we've seen that is going to promote economic development much, much better and faster and more effectively than any kind of foreign aid.
Thank you for that. I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but I know it's relative to what you were talking about. So I was curious to know what's your response. So, and with that, we are coming up against the allotted time for today's webinar. I do appreciate all of our attendees who have joined today. Please look out for the email after today's event. You should be receiving an email with the recording of this webinar along with these materials, so you can check out that excellent Learn Liberty video that Dr. Makovi has linked to. And we'll be sure to see you next month for our next webinar series. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.